Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt. I know that some of you haven't been served, but we need to charge ahead because of we only have this limited amount of time. And so my name is Bill Saunders. I am the chairman of the Religious Liberties Practice Group of the Federalist Society, and we, along with the First Freedom Center, are co-hosting this. We welcome you, and many of you interested in the Federalist Society. We invite you to join. If you're interested in religious liberty, join the practice group. Our topic today are minority religious communities at risk. We're going to have 3 speakers, then we'll have Q&A. I'll field the Q&A, and we will have a microphone for you to ask your questions. I do want to mention as we start, I'm going to introduce each individual speaker. So I'll introduce Ambassador Bell first, and then after he speaks, I'll introduce subsequent speakers. I do want to say just a word quickly for those of you that got the announcement yesterday. We had hoped Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey could be here, but because of all the votes going on up in the Hill, he couldn't be here. And however, he's been very involved in these issues, and in fact, will continue to do so. So we hope to have him at a subsequent event. But we've got 3 great panelists and quite a topic, and I'm sure some of you are going to have questions, so we look forward to that too. Let me introduce Ambassador Bell. He's president of the First Freedom Center. He served for 31 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, concentrating on the Soviet Empire, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. And with Representative Smith, he served on the U.S. delegation to the 2003 Vienna Specialized Meeting of the OSCE on combating anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. He served as Special Envoy for Holocaust issues. Now, the First Freedom Center itself is a nonprofit, non-sectarian, and nonpartisan organization which advances the fundamental human rights of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. In January, the First Freedom Center issued a report on minority religious communities at risk, and I was on the editorial board of that, and I was pleased to serve on that. So without further, Ambassador Bell.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to our partner, the Federalist Society, not only for this program, but for programs on which our 2 institutions have collaborated in the past. It's a wonderful partnership. Both Bill and Ted Stanke, who will speak later, served on our editorial board when we produced our report. I want also, however, to offer the First Freedom Center's profound appreciation to Congressman Smith, who could not be here today. He is a co-chair of the U.S. Congress's Helsinki Commission, which is the Congress's premier venue for considering human rights issues. I've worked with him, with Alcee Hastings from the other side of the aisle, with other members of that commission for some years, and there are no finer spokespersons for our country's heritage of insistence on high standards of human rights and the rule of law. In our report, we and our editors, in addition to describing some of the minority communities that were at risk in our estimation of disappearing over the next decade, gave careful attention to identifying what we call structural barriers to the prospering of minority communities. And these are, in essence, repeated patterns of governmental or societal behavior which prevent minority communities from gaining footing in societies, their legal systems, their economies, or their institutional life. And they often parallel what former United Nations Special Rapporteur for freedom of religion or belief, Asma Jahangir, called early warning signs of discrimination or violence. We attempted to assess these region by region in the report, several copies of which are perhaps circulating among you, not because we wish to impose uniformity where none exists as across a whole continent, but among countries in regions that had similar approaches to governance in matters of religion. For that reason, we focused on things like, multi-layered registration systems in Europe, which can be discriminatory vis-a-vis minority communities, or toward laws on extremism or extremists in countries of the former Soviet world. Among the many barriers we identified, none appeared more frequently than the very pernicious matter of impunity, the failure to investigate or to prosecute. So that's one of three areas I'd like to touch on very briefly today, probably the most important. In her report to the General Assembly of December 2009, Special Rapporteur Asma Jahangir dwelt at some length on the role of the state. She stressed that states have the main responsibility for implementing international human rights standards, including the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief, and went on to note in her report that states must provide redress, they must provide protection, and they must take active measures to prevent the violation of individuals' human rights within religious communities. In her discussion of impunity, she noted that an early warning sign in her list would be the lack of accountability for crimes. It would be a pattern of impunity. But I'd note that this subject of impunity is far from being simply some sort of theoretical aspect of deficient religious liberty. It is the very wellspring of much modern human rights law and practice. Felice Geyer, director of the Blaustein Institute for Human Rights and a commissioner at the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom, notes that the entire development of international criminal courts, and one might even say of international human rights law in the past 10 to 15 years, has centered on solving the problem of impunity. Lemkin himself, and there she's referring to the man who originated the concept and term of genocide, was obsessed with this problem. It should, I think, therefore come as no surprise that for advocates of the rights of individual members of minority communities, the past year has been a depressing one. I will shortly discuss the problems facing Egypt's Coptic Christians, but by way of illustration of the continuing enormity of the problem of impunity, let me say a few words about Nigeria and Pakistan. In Nigeria, the good news is that in the past 5 years, the good news is that 5 persons last year, toward the end of 2010, were convicted of terrorism for their role in the mass Muslim Christian violence in and around Jos. They were, however, practically the only persons prosecuted in any way in the wake of massive violence. Since 1998, religion-related violence has caused some 13,000 deaths in Nigeria and untold displacement. Many churches, mosques, homes, and other properties have been destroyed. The most horrendous incidents have occurred in the Middle Belt region, including in Jos, and violence there and elsewhere has continued well into the springtime of this year. Indeed, following the recent re-election of a Southern Christian president in Nigeria, there has been evidence of heightened tensions and the prospect of new and large-scale outbreaks of violence. In December, 9 bombs exploded in the Jos Market Square, killing at least 30 persons. In January, 40 ethnic Igbo Christians were pulled from a bus and murdered. In March, Boko Haram Islamic extremists murdered Imam Ibrahim Ahmed Abdullahi, an advocate of nonviolence in Boko State. Little or no investigation of this and other violence has occurred. In Nigeria, as in India and elsewhere, authorities often turn to reconciliation and mediation mechanisms rather than investigation and prosecution when they address violence against minorities at all. In Pakistan, the year began with a small measure of hope as Federal Minister for Minorities Shahbaz Bhatti obtained limited relief for victims of religiously motivated mob violence, but he, of course, was assassinated on March 2nd. That assassination was part of what the U.S. Commission has called a qualitative change in religiously linked violence, including an unprecedented level of targeting of government officials and members of minority faith communities. Extremists, including the Pakistani Taliban, have increased the number and viciousness of their attacks on Barlevi Sufis, Shia Muslims, Ahmadiyya Muslims, and Christians. The violence has permeated formerly relatively secure urban centers, and there have been no meaningful investigations or prosecutions, including the cases of Minister Bhatti or of Punjabi Governor Taseer, who was assassinated in January. He, of course, had been a proponent of modification of Pakistan's arbitrary and misused blasphemy law, and the misuse of that law in the case of the Christian woman Asiya Bibi and others has been well documented. Second matter I'd like to touch on briefly is that not all change is positive. And here I have in mind the change which has been occurring in North Africa and the Middle East, referred to frequently as the Arab Spring. Nowhere has that drama unfolded more dramatically than in Egypt, where the massive outpourings of popular will for reform on Cairo's Tahrir Square moved the hearts and minds of the planet. Yet our attention has been drawn also to the continuing propensity, following the fall of the Mubarak regime, for religious violence, not least against the country's Coptic Christian minority. Hosni Mubarak was perhaps the quintessential Arab strongman, authoritarian yet supposedly a secular champion of nominally liberal values, and in consequence he attempted to figure as the essential protector of the Copts against an Islamic majority, or at least against Islamic extremists, Salafis, and other prospective enemies. But the level of unpunished violence against Copts was considerable under Mubarak, including last December and in January on the eve of change. Copts now fear for their future. They are unsure that even the less than ideal balance they were able to strike under Mubarak can continue. The violence, however, does continue. While interim Prime Minister Essam Sharaf signaled renewed efforts to calm tensions, those tensions persisted. Makram Kamel, a young Copt, experienced this in May when a mob of 500 Salafis attacked St. Mary's Church in Cairo, and he was beaten severely. Riots on May 8th saw 15 killed and 250 wounded. Mubarak's departure seems to have unleashed sectarian resentments formerly bottled up. Figures from his regime remain in power as elections are rushed forward in the absence of a truly new constitution. The political alliance announced this week between the Muslim Brotherhood and the country's foremost secular party greatly worries many minorities. Reports this week that under popular pressure, a dual national American-Israeli student of the Arab Spring itself is being held as a spy for Israel, worry the country's vestigial Jewish community. CNN journalist Fareed Zakaria speculated recently that in 10 years' time, Egypt may resemble democratized Indonesia. There's much good in that estimate, but still we recall that at the provincial and communal levels in Indonesia, Ahmadiyya Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and others are overtly disadvantaged and in more than a few instances still brutalized. In Syria, amid the violence of change, majority Sunnis and minority Christians alike worry what may befall them at the hands of an Alawite Shia establishment. In an age of impunity, not all change is good. Last area I will touch upon is rule of law. I would make the point that minority communities and the misfortunes which befall them need, I think, to be seen primarily in the context of rule of law, and not simply in the connection of voluntary tolerance or comity. In our report, we emphasize strongly the universality of the human rights of religious freedom and freedom of conscience, and our belief that that universality is indeed prodigious. tolerate me for a moment while I cite a few legal anchorings in a room full of lawyers and journalists. In 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations accepted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with no votes. That meant acceptance of its premise that every citizen of every state should enjoy freedom of religion and conscience, the right to change religions, the right to manifest religious beliefs either alone or in communities. In subsequent votes on treaties, on other documents which specifically reincorporate the provisions of the Universal Declaration, every country in the United Nations system has consciously and specifically accepted the rights in the Universal Declaration. That's 192 states. That commits them to the Universal Declaration's Article 30, which specifies that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights or freedoms set forth herein. By signing the United Nations Covenants on Political Rights and on economic, cultural, and social rights, all these countries have granted the rights in the Universal Declaration de jure status, binding status. They also signed in 1993 the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, which affirmed the Universal Declaration as the world standard, said in its paragraph 5 that all human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, and specified that it is the duty of states, regardless of their political, economic, and cultural systems, to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. I cite all of that by way of noting that the rights of the individuals who make up minority communities are a matter of detailed and specific law. The non-observance of that law and the failure to punish its violation is not a matter of relativism. It is a matter of deep concern. In theocratic Iran, which continues to abuse Baha'is, Christians, and Sufis, in unimaginably awful North Korea, where any actual expressive belief or believer faces labor camp and probable death, in Saudi Arabia, which bans all religious practice other than the regime's own specific interpretation of Islam, and in countless other lands. The mistreatment of religious minorities tears the fabric of rights and law and weakens rather than strengthens states and entire regions. For that reason, it is of the utmost importance that the law be upheld. The law, in the end, is the bulwark not only of minorities, but also of the majorities who live with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bell. Our next speaker is Ted Stanke from the Human Rights First organization. He joined them in January of 2008 as director of the Fighting Discrimination Program and currently serves as director of policy and programs. Prior to joining Human Rights First, he worked on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2000 to 2007 as deputy executive director for policy as well as acting executive director in 2002 and 2007. He led the Commission's efforts to strengthen U.S. foreign policy to advance the right to religious freedom, and he participated in fact-finding missions around the globe. Tad.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. And thanks, everyone, for being here. And thanks to the Federalist Society and the First Freedom Center for inviting me to speak this afternoon. At Human Rights First, we seek to advance U.S. leadership to promote and protect human rights globally. So some of what I'm going to say today is going to touch on U.S. policy. Time and again, we find that protecting rights not only reflects American values, but also serves U.S. interests abroad. interests of national security, regional stability, and economic cooperation. And this is certainly true with respect to what we're talking about today, which is promoting freedom of religion or belief, and I would say also freedom of expression is very much related to that, and protections for minorities against violence and repression. And it's certainly true that having a different religion or different views about religion is dangerous in many parts of the world. We have religious tensions that might exist in any society, as well as friction between individual freedom and the state. But far too often, government failures allow these problems to lead to repression and violence. When political leadership promotes uniformity or exclusion rather than unity and pluralism, and when it fails to condemn bigotry and extremism, when public officials do not or cannot protect individuals and communities, and when governments fail to implement the rule of law. And these failures affect not only religious believers and practitioners, but also marginalized and repressed members of minorities of all kinds. So what I thought I would do today is to discuss briefly 3 examples of repression and violence, and those are Pakistan, Egypt, and Bahrain. And one of the things that ties them all together is that they're all countries that are extremely important to current national interests of the United States. But in focusing on these 3, so I have to make a disclaimer that it's not to suggest that there aren't problems elsewhere in the world. Obviously there are in places like China and Burma, Vietnam, Saudi, some of the ones that Randy mentioned. It's also not to say that problems exist only in predominantly Muslim countries. It exists in regions, throughout the world, and it's certainly true, as you see in the First Freedom Report, that minorities, all religious groups are minorities somewhere, and they can all be subject to repression and targeted violence. So, with respect to Pakistan, I won't repeat some of the things that Randy mentioned, but it's clear that successive governments in Pakistan have not effectively confronted religious extremism. They've allowed it to grow and exert greater and greater influence. The blasphemy laws were cited. They continue to be abused. We found 60 cases in 2010 against both Muslims and non-Muslims. And it's not just being charged with a crime here. Defendants, judges, defense lawyers have all been killed and intimidated, making a fair trial all but impossible. And those who are charged, their cases languish for years. Randy mentioned Asiya Bibi as a prominent case, a woman who's been now for 2 years in jail facing a death sentence. And unfortunately, efforts to change these laws were stopped in their tracks by the killings of Salman Taseer and Shahbaz Bhatti, 2 prominent reformers. Not only were government efforts stopped in that regard, but also civil society pressure has largely been silenced on account of those murders. And although we do have several brave voices that continue to speak out and attempt to be heard, there's also the serious problem of impunity for targeted killings and sectarian violence. Impunity is a problem for all sorts of violence in Pakistan, but especially in these instances. The Taseer murder, you have the killer in custody, but you don't have progress on the case and bringing that person to justice. In the Bhatti murder, there seems to be very little progress whatsoever. There's recently a trial of some 70 persons who are thought to be responsible for communal violence against Christians, killing 8, destroying churches and homes in Pakistan in 2009. All of these people were acquitted, and you can imagine the signal that sends as far as this important question of impunity goes. The Ahmadiyya are also subject to violence, as are Shia and other Muslims. According to the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, 99 Ahmadiyyas were killed in faith-based violence during 2010, and 69 cases against Ahmadiyyas were brought for practicing their religion. So it's clear that the government of Pakistan needs to take some clear and forceful steps to push back on extremism and try to create some more space for civil society to do that as well. They need to take steps to bring Taseer's and Bhati's murderers to justice, to investigate and prosecute those responsible for planning and executing attacks targeting religious minorities, and to protect those accused of blasphemy and assert greater control over these proceedings to try to ensure some form of fair trial or some meaningful opportunity for people to defend themselves. These are hard things for the current government to do, but they're extremely important. The future of Pakistan is at stake, and the future of Pakistan is also intimately tied into our future here in the United States. And you can see no more important policy priority from the United States point of view than to help strengthen the will and the ability of the Pakistani government to combat extremism. The U.S. needs to continue to make clear at the highest levels this expectation that these steps will be taken, as well as to find ways, probably behind the scenes, to support it. Let me mention quickly Egypt. Randy suggested that sectarian tensions there may be increasing because they've been bottled up under the Mubarak regime. Well, I don't know. We don't exactly see it that way. This sectarian tension and growing violence was occurring under the Mubarak regime. There has been institutionalized discrimination against Christians and an official failure to hold those who instigate and perpetrate violence against Christians accountable for their crimes. And primarily, what you saw under Mubarak, and the danger here, is that sectarian divisions are exploited for political gain. And the fanning of sectarian tensions is an easy way to demonstrate insecurity, for which repression and authoritarianism is the answer. And this obviously is something that we all would like to avoid with the new Egyptian government and the changes that are taking place there. Another quality of the Mubarak government in dealing with these issues was to blame outsiders for the problem. And unfortunately, we continue to see Egypt's interim leaders still at it. Earlier this week, interim deputy prime minister blamed Israel for stirring up sectarian tensions in the country, but presented no evidence in that regard. So the interim government needs to confront this problem and stop blaming outsiders for inciting strife. Again, like in Pakistan, they need to hold accountable those who engage in violence, who engage in incitement to violence. Egypt has a crying need for legal protections, true legal protections against discrimination, has been recognized by their National Human Rights Council. We have some concerns about the new draft unified law on places of worship, which leaves religious communities who've been denied permission to build or renovate places of worship with no legal redress, no court access, over-involvement by the security services in religious affairs in Egypt. These are all problems that we had under Mubarak. These are all changes, fundamental changes that need to be made for Egypt to be heading in a different direction as part of its democratic change. So again, important for the United States government to push for stronger accountability measures against those who engage in sectarian violence, to promote police reform. A credible police force that delivers protection and delivers justice is extremely important. And finally, that they should be urging credible institutional and legal reform to help the Egyptians put in place legal safeguards against discrimination. And we believe that the current discussion about U.S. aid to the country is an important one in which to express these ideas, and that aid can be structured to incentivize the reforms. The third place I'll mention is Bahrain, where the government has violently cracked down on protests and calls for democratic change. They've thrown human rights and democracy activists in jail. And in so doing, they have also, seems to be deliberately, inflamed sectarian divisions, which is a dangerous development in that country. Dozens of Shia mosques and places of worship have been demolished as part of the government crackdown. And this is seen by many in Bahrain as part of a government's wider effort to to cleanse the country. When security forces are breaking into the homes of people in the opposition, they take particular target at destroying religious items that people might have in their homes. And that this is, we had a mission there recently, and it was really, our person was very much struck by the attitude of many of the people that he was talking to in the opposition, human rights activists, etc. It was that, well, it's bad that the government is torturing people, that they're detaining people arbitrarily, that they're having these show trials. That's all bad, but it actually takes it a step further to target the mosques and to target people's religion. So that in some ways it's even worse what the government is doing. It's even beyond, in some ways, the passing the point of no return. Whereas you might have reconciliation for some of these human rights abuses, like the arrests and the disappearances, but it's harder to imagine a situation where you can walk back that targeting of religion. So we welcome the fact that in his Middle East speech on May 19th, President Obama specifically called for an end to the destruction of mosques in Bahrain. Unfortunately, we have not seen further public statements from senior U.S. officials in that regard. It's important for the United States to engage with the Shia community in Bahrain for its long-term strategic interests. This is an educated class of people who will continue to be an important element in the region, and the U.S. should not be standing by while they are being suppressed. So I'll just make one final point. It's a theme that was in Randy's remarks about solving this problem of impunity, impunity for violence. We at Human Rights First, we've worked for several years on the issue of bias-motivated violence in the context of Europe and the former Soviet Union. And in that context, a variety of tools have been developed, policy tools that have been developed inside the OSCE, and some of which have been used bilaterally between the U.S. government and other governments, help in establishing laws, in training police, in training prosecutors, in trying to promote more political will to address the questions of violence and discrimination, and importantly, to help train civil society groups to monitor violence and to advocate around it, to try to bring communities together. I mean, these are all things in which there is some hope for a success. We've seen it in some places where this has operated. Now, obviously, this is a problem that we're talking about out, beyond, certainly beyond Europe and other places, but like Nigeria and India, Indonesia, Iraq. So we feel like this is an avenue that should be pursued, a practical avenue that should be pursued to get back to some of those failings that I talked about at the very beginning. So to bring international pressure, to get political leaders to stand up to condemn what's going on in their country, and to also provide them with some of the tools with which to bring greater rule of law, bring greater justice, and to try to reverse this tide of violence and impunity with regard to religious minorities. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. Our third speaker is Dr. Thomas Farr, who's a visiting assistant professor of religion and international affairs at Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. He's senior fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and director of the Religious Freedom Project and the program on religion and U.S. foreign policy. He is also a veteran of the Foreign Service, where for a time he served as the director of the Office of International Religious Freedom, and his book, published by Oxford University Press, is entitled World of Freedom, of Faith and Freedom, Why International Religious Liberty is Vital to American National Security. Tom.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to the Federalist Society, the First Freedom Center. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with my friend Bill Saunders, with Ambassador Randy Bell, who is a real veteran in matters of foreign affairs and a real important addition to the small circle of people who do religious liberty for a living, and to my good friend Tad Stanke, with whom I've collaborated for the better part of a decade, to my profit. Bill mentioned that I direct a program called the Religious Liberty Project. It's new. We just started it. We're excited about it at Georgetown. If you're interested, we brought some pamphlets along, and you're welcome to take one. I also brought along a couple of copies of a book I published with Dennis Hoover a few years ago entitled The Future of U.S. Religious Freedom Policy, Recommendations for the Obama Administration. It's not yet a bestseller in the administration, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. I have an impossible task at some level today, and that is to fill in for Chris Smith, who's been a hero of mine for more than a decade. And those of you who don't know the voice of Chris Smith, you owe it to yourselves to hear that voice. I was at a hearing the other day when Frank Wolf, another lion of the religious freedom movement, said, you know, I just wouldn't want to be in a Congress without the voice of Chris Smith, and I certainly agree with that. So I'm sorry he couldn't be here today, but it's an honor to stand in for him. Like everybody else here, I've got 3 points to make. Have you ever noticed? I think it's a reason for hope. Let me tell you what they are, and then I'll go back and fill in the blanks a little bit. First point is that religious minorities, the treatment of religious minorities is of critical importance, obviously to them, but also to their societies, and I would argue to the national security of the United States. The second point is that the United States has done a very poor job in addressing this issue for a long time, but most palpably in the last 13 years since the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act, when we have officially had a policy of trying to address these issues. Third, I think that there is a solution at hand, or at least a partial solution. There are a number of them. And some of these solutions are to be found in the current amendment to the International Religious Freedom Act, which some of you know about, put forward by a host of co-sponsors along with Congressman Frank Wolf and Chris Smith. And I'll end up by saying a few words about why I think these amendments are worthy of your support and important to this issue of the treatment of religious minorities around the world, and also important to American interests around the world and in the homeland. First, why is this important? Well, it's of obvious importance to the people who are being tortured and raped and imprisoned and disappeared. The Ahmadiyya, the Shiites of Saudi Arabia, the Copts of Egypt, the Chaldeans of Iraq, the Uyghurs of China. I want to make the argument, though, that it's in the interests of these societies themselves to solve these problems. And by solving the problem, I mean more than stop torturing, raping, imprisoning, and brutalizing. It's much more than that. If this were easy, it would have been solved a long time ago. It's a matter of justice and human dignity, but it's also a matter of the national interests of these countries and our own. To put the matter, to paint with a very broad brush, but to put it simply, if you want stability, if you want security, especially if you want stable democracy, and think of the countries that say they want stable democracy today. They're struggling with it. You can't have it if you don't solve this problem, which is a problem involving the treatment of your religious minorities, but also the treatment of your religious majorities. Majorities have an interest in the success of their states. We need to be making this argument to the majorities on behalf of the minorities, and we don't do this very well, on which more in just a minute. But there's plenty of evidence for this assertion that I'm making. There's evidence in history. I would cite the history of the Roman Catholic Church. And there's plenty of evidence in modern scholarship to suggest that you can't have stable democracy without religious freedom in full, which means protecting religious minorities, but also involving all religious communities in the democratic public square within limits, and those limits are very important. And that evidence is provided by the work of people like Brian Grimm at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Some of you are familiar with this. He and Roger Finke have just come out with a book, The Price of Freedom Denied. Nice title, I think. I mean, it's very high price, very high price. It's not only the suffering of the Ahmadiyya and the Bahai and the Christians. It is the security and stability of many regions of the world and our interests, because we have an interest in stability and security and the success of people who want democracy. Second point, we don't do this very well. Now, to some of you, this is an old subject, but to some of you, if this is a typical argument, you may not have heard this before. We've had an International Religious Freedom Act for 13 years, a policy of advancing religious freedom. No administration has done this well, least of all this administration. It has failed. One exhibit, Exhibit A, it has taken 2.5 years for this administration to put in place the senior official responsible for carrying out this policy, the ambassador at large for religious freedom. There was no mystery that this position had to be filled. It wasn't complicated. 2.5 years, well over half the administration is gone, and Ambassador Susan Johnson Cook stepped into her job the week before last. That is a disgrace. Every senior envoy that you can think of under the sun, under this administration, many of them quite good, have been there for a long time. Women's rights, disabilities, HIV/AIDS, closing Guantanamo. Some of this stuff is controversial, but it tells you something about the priorities of the United States, that the first freedom of American history waited 2.5 years before the person was in place. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, there's much more to be said, and I'd be happy to say it, and have, but I think I've made the point. But the problem is not just any administration. Bill Saunders and I wrote a piece on the performance of the Bush administration, which wasn't terribly sterling on this issue either. Part of the problem is the culture of the State Department, the way the office has been treated, this issue of religious minorities. I can make you weep, as can Tad and Randy and Bill and a lot of people in this room, telling you stories, true stories of the suffering of human beings. I can make policymakers weep, but 10 minutes later it will have no policy relevance because it will take its place way down the list of things that are important to the United States. And this ought to be important to the United States, not just because human beings are suffering. I mean, that's a heck of a thing to have to say. But we can't solve the problem of every human being that's suffering in the world. We can't. We don't have the power. What we can do is get in front of the problem and begin actually to advance the habits and institutions of religious liberty, instead of doing what, in my view, we've done the past 13 years, and that is curse religious persecution. That's been our policy. Rhetorical condemnations. Now, we have a report, which is good. It's an annual report. It's the best in the world. But it's words. We have an annual condemnation called the Countries of Particular Concern. It's very important. It needs to continue. There's some good things in the Wolf Bill about this. There's some suggestions out there. But it's not enough. I've never found any country in the world frankly, any human being who will respond to the following proposition: come, let us reason about what's wrong with you. We need programs. We need more than condemnation. We need to integrate this into the State Department. Third point, here's how I think we can do it and how the Wolf amendments, which I urge you to support, I mean, call your member of Congress, your senator, and urge them to support, what is it, H.R. 1856, which is the House version of the amendment to the International Religious Freedom Act, presented by Representative Wolf and other co-sponsors. 3 points again, and then I'll stop, that this amendment proposes amendments to the IRFA. The first is the elevation of the status and authority of the ambassador at large. For 13 years, this position has been buried, compartmentalized, isolated in the Department of State with very little influence. And it doesn't matter how wonderful Ambassador Johnson Cook's rhetorical skills are, and they are formidable. They're words. She needs to have the authority and the opportunity and the status to integrate this issue into the very difficult bureaucracy of Foggy Bottom. And this amendment will require the State Department to do what it should have done 13 years ago, and that is put this office under the Secretary of State. Do you realize that every other ambassador at large, save one, is under the Secretary of State, ambassador at large for women's issues, ambassador at large for war crimes. I think there's one other, I forget what it is. Doesn't matter. The point is, why bury this issue in the Human Rights Bureau, which is where it is? Make the ambassador at large work for a lower ranking official. What does that communicate? To American diplomats, it communicates this is not important, and we can safely ignore this woman or this man within the bureaucracy. That sounds kind of cruel, but there it is. If you've ever worked at C Street, you know I'm telling the truth. It also communicates to foreign governments that this is not a priority of the United States. So that needs to change. The Wolf Bill will change it. Second thing it will do is to empower the ambassador at large, the office of ambassador at large, not only by the status it puts into the ambassador's position, but it gives this person some money. How do you promote anything systematically with anything other than words if you don't have any U.S. funding behind you to do it? Now, there has been some funding over the last several years. The Human Rights and Democracy Fund has done some good work here, but we need this to be, we need a Marshall Plan, and we need substantial funding. Now, this is not the right environment to ask the Congress to appropriate more money, but there's money that can be shifted. So it's there. It can be a revenue-neutral approach, a line-item appropriation to the ambassador at large for religious freedom. Finally, training of Foreign Service officers and American diplomats. The first IRFA, the existing IRFA, said, "Thou shalt do this." It said, "Thou shalt do a lot of things," and the State Department said, "Right." And it's proceeded in the last 13 years not to do that at all. I mean, I've often wondered why Congress hasn't paid a little more attention to this. The State Department has had episodic, non-mandatory, occasional training. And let me just tell you, as somebody who worked in that building, and I'm sure Randy will agree, you know, if you find out at all that they're going to have a voluntary session over in Roslyn, there's just no way you have the time to do it. It has to be mandatory. It has to be part of the wallpaper. So when you come into the State Department, you have that training about religious freedom, about why it's important to your job. Your job as a Foreign Service officer is to engage the world in defense of American interests. The world is religious. It doesn't matter what you are, a holy roller or an atheist. If you're a Foreign Service officer, American diplomat, you have got to promote religious freedom because that's your job. We haven't been doing it. We haven't been training them to do it. So we have this ad hoc approach. The Wolf amendments will change that. It's very important. So, in short, this issue of religious minorities is a problem of terrible suffering. It has a humanitarian dimension to it that I certainly do not intend to trivialize. The the most rewarding moments I had in my 4 years in the Office of Religious Freedom had to do with one family, a family of Iranian Christians that I had the honor to work over the course with Faith and others here today to help out of a terrible situation. That's the face of religious persecution. I don't mean in any way in talking about programs and money to belittle that. But we have failed. We've done nothing for these people in any systematic way, and it is a disgrace, and we need to change it. Thank you.
Before we do the questions, we have a short message that Congressman Chris Smith sent that Ambassador Bell will read to you.
Thank you. We just received this a few minutes ago. Let me read it out to you. Dean Reuter, Ambassador Bell, Ted Stanke, Tom Farr, distinguished guests, please accept my apologies that I am not able to join you in person today for a discussion of the very important topic of religious freedom for religious minorities of every creed. Religious freedom is the first freedom. It is the constant reminder to governments that governments exist under fundamental law, not of their own making, and it is a constant reminder to populations of the human dignity of their fellow man, no matter what the religious creed or non-creed espoused. In short, a civilization cannot survive in peace and justice without religious freedom. The First Freedom Center has made a valuable contribution to the field of religious freedom protection by drawing our attention to the specific plights of often overlooked minority religious groups around the world, focusing in particular on how the rights of these groups are threatened by those who would limit religious freedom based on cultural relativism. Make no mistake, cultural relativism is a true threat. It was espoused recently as an excuse by our own president regarding China's failures to protect human rights. The First Freedom Center's report shows us the true risks of cultural relativism, highlighting in clear relief how such relativism undermines the fundamental premise for all human rights, that the rights exist for every human being regardless of culture. I commend the Federalist Society for holding this event today and for their constant and practical contributions to the intellectual framework that has made the United States a just nation and beacon of human rights to the world. My best wishes to you all. In addition, I would note there is a lot of legislation on the Hill. We've talked of the Wolf Bill. There's also H.R. 440, which deals with the proposal to create a special envoy dealing with regions of the world that we've discussed today where a lot of change has taken place. And I just wanted to add one point, that is that as a Foreign Service officer, I always found that human rights are advanced most practically when they become part of the warp and woof of the conduct of American foreign policy. We may all take different perspectives on how that can be done. The legislation under consideration in many quarters has its own sets of plumbing, but you will never advance the cause of religious minorities or the freedom of religion and of the individual human conscience unless it is integrated into the warp and woof of the conduct of bilateral and multilateral policy. If there is any message you carry away today, I hope it is that. Thank you.
Okay, where's David Ray? There he is. Okay, we can take questions and answers. I would ask the panelists, maybe you could just answer from these microphones and I'll stand up here and field the questions. Do we have any questions? Okay, here we go. And you could just identify yourself and not go on too long.
No, Bill, you know me better than that. Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. We talked a lot about the issue of impunity, and I would say one of the kings of impunity is Omar al-Bashir. Right now, there's extermination going on in the Nuba Mountains. And my question is, well, especially for you, Mr. Stanke, what is Human Rights First saying about this situation? Some of the official statements I've seen from the government have really portrayed it in a morally equivalent way and have not taken consideration of the fact that Khartoum has said that they're exterminating the Nuba people. And this is a religious minority issue too, because even though many of the Nuba are Muslims, they're considered apostates by Khartoum. So.
Yeah.
You want to take
Yeah, if you could.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thanks for that question. Events that are unfolding in Sudan in a very disturbing way are of great concern, to Human Rights First. And we, I think, have been quite clear that the government of Sudan needs to be held accountable for its policies and the effect of its policies, and that and that's both in Darfur and in the conflict between the North and the South. We see the greatest hope in the reconciliation and independence related and implementation of that. There's obviously some conflicts that are going on and that will, it looks like, ensue despite some efforts by the international community, and it's something that the U.S. government continues to remain very much seized on in order to ensure that there's peaceful independence for South Sudan.
And if Tom or Ambassador Bell want to comment.
Tom?
No, please.
No, I would only note that when you get to a question of whether a government regards someone as apostate, then you are dealing with a subset of the wider issue of establishment and the broader problem we have focused on in our report and elsewhere of constitutional espousals of one religious identity over another. And of course that gets back to what kind of world we want and what values do we as a government and as a people wish to encourage.
Well, I will take the opportunity to add to what Randy just said, that issues such as apostasy, blasphemy, defamation, conversion, which those of us in this field are constantly speaking of, and we spoke a great deal about it, both of my colleagues did. For example, the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, the murders that have occurred as a result of people opposing those laws. To me, and I'm agreeing here with Randy, the solution to these problems is, in effect, to privatize them. We don't want to argue that blasphemy doesn't exist or that apostasy doesn't exist. Those of us who are religious people and who feel strongly about our religious truth claims have every right to want to assert those claims and keep others in the club. But and it seems to me this is where we want to go with this. I mentioned the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church at one point took a very harsh stance on issues of apostasy and blasphemy. But what it came to do in the Second Vatican Council was to recognize that while it was not changing its claims to be the one true church left by Christ, which should be embraced by all, it was no longer insisting on any privileged access to civil authority in talking about blasphemy. So I'm coming back to Randy's point here. This is a question that we have to get away from governments and from the issue of violence. So we don't say nobody blasphemes or nobody is an apostate, but we do say that you deal with that by better preaching and teaching. You don't deal with it by violence or access to the police powers of the state.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, panelists, for a very interesting conversation. My question is about, I'm Roger Candelaria. My question is about programs. Let's say we took up a little collection and we came up with enough money to have some impact. What specific kinds of programs, both governmental and non-governmental, would you advocate that would actually make a difference?
Now that has got to be a softball that you've been hoping to get.
Thank you for that question. First of all, I don't think we have deep enough pockets in this room to do what I'm talking about. But what I think we need to do, one way to answer that question is think of the National Endowment for Democracy. Most of you are familiar with this organization. It was created in the early 80s by President Reagan, and it was a bipartisan, Tip O'Neill, a Democratic-controlled Congress, as I recall at the time. The notion was it is in the strategic interest of the United States to promote democracy around the world. We have spent, I don't know how much, but billions, tens of billions of dollars since 1983 seeding the institutions and habits of democracy. Until very recently, those dollars have not been spent on issues of religious freedom. They've been spent on what perfectly legitimate democratic concerns. But it's as if the United States had no reason to believe that religious freedom were a constituent and necessary element of successful democracy. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about empowering groups that are in countries that are already moving and that already understand this. I'm talking about creating programs that will help those who are capable of understanding the necessity of religious freedom but have never had it put to them in these terms. So that's a very broad answer, but a short answer to your question. I think you can. I want a national endowment for religion, so to speak, or the advancement of religious freedom, not religion. I mean, that would. I know I can hear the. Sorry, strike that. Doug Johnston once said we need religion czars in the Foreign Service, and I know several people who just fainted dead away when they heard that in the building. So, but I think we want to spend money on these, and that money needs to be concentrated in a group of people who have thought this through. It isn't just a matter of handing out money. And by the way, you can get people killed by giving them U.S. money. Okay, so it's not easy. This is not a silver bullet, but we need a strategy in every country that is accentuated by the use of U.S. funds, the possibility of U.S. funds, to empower indigenous actors who already want religious freedom for their own country.
So Tom's exactly right about finding allies and empowering them, and to do it in a smart way, to bring up people's ability in country to monitor, to document, to speak out, to create some political space within their own societies, and to not have the actions of the United States be ones that contract that space, but try to expand it. So, I mean, there's a variety of programs that can be deployed to this effort. I mentioned some about specifically targeting violence. There are plenty of things that can be done in that area. Another thing that can be done is to create more legitimacy for this type of work in country by connecting activists to regional bodies, to places where their own governments have said, we commit to doing something. It's not at the UN, it's not bilaterally necessarily with the United States, but it's in Southern Africa or Western Africa or in the ASEAN region, where you can, again, increase the legitimacy of what people are doing and help them to be more effective.
I would just note, we already know how to do this. It's amazing how quickly we forget our successes. Tad mentioned OSCE. Let's bear in mind the OSCE has great experience and expertise in identifying best practices and holding international meetings that describe and bind countries to best practices. We did this, there was a mention in the introduction of me as a speaker of the 2003 meeting in Vienna. There were subsequent meetings to that in Berlin and elsewhere that looked at how governments can use program money to try and establish and inculcate for police, for courts, and for civil society best practices that avoid conflict and violence among religious communities and other constituents. Beyond that, though, we did, under the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, 2 separate processes of the enlargement of the NATO alliance. And those were case examples, classic examples of the combining of real measures of democratization, of human rights, including especially the rights of minority communities, both to exist and to reconstitute themselves, with the process of enlarging the alliance. And they were instances in which the executive branch and the Congress worked hand in hand. We traveled to capitals in candidate countries and made clear that those countries were not going to make it through the Senate unless they subscribed to specific steps and measures. So we know how to do this. We still insist that people pass certain bars to become members of the World Trade Organization. The Europeans still open and close complicated chapters for entry of candidate countries into the European Union, a process that may be somewhat decelerated now, but we know how to do this. And we can put together government programs with budgets adduced to those programs if we have the leadership to tell people to do it.
Yes, my name is Jim Haynes, and I had two questions, and you can respond to whichever one you like. The first was the topic of the European Union. You've spent a great deal of time talking about Asia and Africa. Are there any issues regarding religious freedom in the sort of tolerant, rationalist, Brussels-dominated European Union that would give pause to someone who was concerned about religious freedom? The second topic has to do with the linkage between religious freedom and a broad commitment in a society and in a political system to freedom of speech, what we Americans call First Amendment free speech. Is it possible, in your opinion, to have meaningful freedom of religion on topics that stress societies without having a sort of predicate commitment to allowing people to talk in a disturbing way about other issues, economic issues, political expression? In other words, can religious freedom meaningfully exist in the State Department or any place else unless it is linked strongly with other fundamental rights, particularly the right of free speech?
I think all of you can take those as you wish. Yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly about Europe, as we've spoken to in our report and otherwise, yes, there are serious issues that need monitoring and with which we should engage, concerning which we should engage our European allies. The Council of Europe, which monitors democracy and human rights on that continent, can find certain systems of registration or even establishment consistent with the European Declaration of Human Rights. That would mean on the surface that they're all consistent with the Universal Declaration. But the proof is in the administration. Registration systems in a number of countries in Europe clearly disadvantage minority and newcomer faiths. They do so especially when they're coupled with special measures, including statutory ones, concerning so-called cults or sects, which extend to the monitoring of cults or sects. This has been particularly evident in France, in Belgium. Several other countries have emulated France's sect law. There's been a sect filter in place at the state and occasionally the federal level in Germany with regard to Jehovah's Witnesses, the Church of Scientology, and others in various ways. So yes, there are issues that need to be watched. With regard to the relationship between freedom of religion and freedom of speech, yes, they're extremely closely related because freedom of religion involves free exercise. And how can you exercise if you don't have the freedom to do so? An area of concern, again, with respect to Europe, and a difference between our First Amendment-dominated legal system and theirs is hate speech. And that can become problematic. If you have a system such as that in the United Kingdom where the Home Department decides that certain people and organizations may enter the society or not according to what they have said, that may require, if you want to look at its specific relationship to the Universal Declaration, careful analysis.
So I also wanted to talk respond briefly about the question of freedom of expression. So I agree with you completely that you have to promote religious freedom as part of other fundamental freedoms for the reason that you mentioned, that they are very much linked together, and you're not going to find one parsed out from another in any place you're seeking to effectuate some change. The other thing is that as a strategic matter, right, getting back to Tom's point about you don't invite people over so you can tell them what's wrong with them. From a strategic matter, it may be more effective in certain contexts to work on the issues of religious freedom, through the lens of freedom of expression or rule of law or administration of justice and other sorts of things. The problem comes in, though, with what Tom is saying about that can't be an excuse, within the U.S. government not to pay attention to these particular issues. We work at Human Rights First, we work on several issues that cuts across religion and race and sexual orientation and others. You have distinct problems, and many times you have shared solutions, but each element needs to be paid attention to, and each element needs to be addressed in its fullest. The only thing that I would say about Europe, to complement what Randy said, is that what we've found in Europe is there's tremendous issue in relation to inclusion of minorities. And it goes beyond just religious minorities, although people who are, in some contexts, thought to be overly religious are thought to be a danger, or sufficiently foreign in their religion are thought to be a danger. And these people can be run into problems both with the state and in private life, including violence. And it's getting over this barriers to inclusion in some of those societies that is the key, because there is no doubt that in the European Union you do have more protections for human rights and the rule of law, commitment to the rule of law, than in many of the countries that we're talking about.
I think that Europe has some terrific problems with religious freedom that ought to occupy us, because they are, in some ways, a harbinger of problems that are coming to the United States. It is part of the problem is I like to bash the French at some point in every presentation. The French understanding of religious freedom is not and never has been the American understanding of religion. There is no such thing as a Western understanding of religious freedom, in my opinion. The French understanding of religious freedom is that as a private matter, people should be allowed to do their mumbo-jumbo on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, but it must not intrude into the public square. And this gets into your question about free speech. Remember, the American founders did not establish freedom of speech until they established the free exercise of religion. They're both part of the First Amendment. The first 16 words of the First Amendment are devoted to the protection of religious freedom. And I'm convinced that they believed, and I certainly believe, that religious freedom incorporates the right to free religious speech. So I would go even further than your question suggests. I certainly agree they're connected. I would say that religious freedom, a constituent element of religious freedom, is the right of religious actors to speak out on the basis of their religious beliefs. Obviously, there are some limits, but those limits have to be very, very broadly drawn. And yes, at the end of the day, it does involve the right to defame someone else's religion, or the right to express condemnation, moral condemnation of behavior. Tad mentioned sexual orientation. This is a major issue of conscience that has arisen in the United Kingdom, in the continent, in Canada, and is very much on the American agenda. What do you do with an assertion of a right to sexual orientation or gay marriage if there are substantial numbers of people who, as a matter of conscience, object to this? There have to be winners and losers on such issues. Democracies have to decide these. But in the United Kingdom, they've just decided it, and there's no discussion about it. A recent case that many of you may know of, a Christian couple were attempting to adopt a child, but refused to sign something that said they would raise the child to believe that homosexuality was perfectly fine, because they couldn't. They couldn't commit to that. And as a consequence, they were barred from adopting a child. This is a threat to religious freedom. This is a threat to freedom of conscience. It's terribly difficult, but it's terribly important. And so I think we need to talk about this in a reasoned way. We need to put this on the table and not run from it. I believe that this administration has been guilty of doing just that. I mean, I think it's advancing gay rights. I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't want to talk so much about religious freedom, because it sees it as a potential competitor to LBGT rights. Well, all right, let's have a conference on that. Let's talk about that. Is that what's in the interest of the United States? So Europe is important for all of these reasons, both because the center of Europe is France as far as this issue is concerned, this issue being religious freedom broadly, but because of this creeping failure to engage the rights of conscience. And it's coming here, so we need to pay attention to it.
I'm Kitty Wang with Newtown Dynasty Television. I have two questions regarding China. We know the human rights situation in China is very poor, and in the last couple of years, United States and China have the annual human rights dialogue. But what we see is that the situation there is just getting worse and worse. I'm wondering, how do you think about this mechanism? How to improve it, make it more effective? And the second question is Congressman Chris Smith. He introduced a bill just a couple of weeks ago that would ask the United States to restrict those human rights abusers, like Chinese officials, high-level officials, from entering this country. So I'm wondering, could you share your thought about that?
Well, it's obvious that the situation has deteriorated in China. I wish I had an answer for you about how to improve the human rights dialogue or how to improve U.S. engagement with China. I think a lot of people are searching now, given what's happened recently, particularly a crackdown on lawyers and others who are thought to be a great hope to improving the situation from within China. I mean, one thing that has to be happening is that the clear messages from the administration, not just in the context of a human rights dialogue, not have this be cabined in a special dialogue, but have it be part of a strategic dialogue, with China, to make the case to the Chinese about how ultimately their repression of human rights, repression of religious freedom, is going to undermine its relations with the United States, undermine the ongoing interaction that is necessary for China, but unfortunately also necessary for the United States. Which creates some of the difficulty here. So,
one other aspect of this, yes, our relations are an important potential lever, but let's bear in mind China exists in a region as well, with neighbors who are terribly important to it, both as trading partners and as competitors, most visibly in some instances with respect to the seabed, natural resources, etc. But that opens the question, what kind of regional framework is there to influence China, which brings to mind ASEAN and the differences between ASEAN on the one hand and the European Union or the OSCE on the other. In an ideal world, one would be able to take a page out of the books of OSCE and the European Union and influence ASEAN in some measure to be an organ of regional integration with human rights standards. A difficult challenge for a body that includes Burma and doesn't do much about it. A difficult challenge for trading relationships like that between China and Burma on the one hand and India on the other, which occasionally values trade over human rights. But there is, I would simply submit, a regional aspect to this as well. Terribly worrisome what is happening in China, the extent to which in some instances the rights of religious minorities cohere with those of ethnic minorities. Very worrisome.
I support the Chinese-American human rights dialogue. I've been a participant in 3 or 4 of them. I fear that they have become little more than America management tools for the China government. It's very difficult to influence a country of 1.2 billion people, or whatever it is these days, with an annual dialogue, which is a set-piece diplomatic dance at which one side speaks and the other side speaks. You know, it's not worth nothing, but it ain't everything. It's not enough. And this is where I come back to the programs, to the question the gentleman asked over here. There are some good programs, by the way, ongoing in China, but it's a huge, huge player. And I fear that the answer of, please change your policies because you're going to harm your relations with us is like, my going to the banker that I owe every dime I own to, and saying, you're going to damage your relationship with me if you aren't a little bit nicer to me. It just doesn't work very well. And I think that this administration has long ago abandoned that. And frankly, even though I don't like what the President and Secretary have said in China, one can understand almost what they're getting at. I mean, they've moved. This isn't important to them as far as they're concerned. So I think what we need to do is develop a long-term strategy for China and go through some of the doors that the Chinese have opened for us, the academic world. There are more Chinese academics interested in religion than there are in every college in the United States, faculties. They're interested in the rule of law. There are lots of openings there. I would say they're also interested in stable economic growth. Now, they've achieved enormous economic growth over the last couple of decades, but they've got to keep it going. A lot of people have been lifted out of poverty, but millions, tens of millions still in poverty. Religious freedom, there's a correlation between religious freedom and stable economic growth. And productivity, there's an argument to be made here, which is one reason I've argued for having American economic diplomats to have training on religious freedom and to be able to talk the talk of religious freedom in their economic discussions with the Chinese and, frankly, other people around the world. But there's a lot of work involved in teeing something like that up. I think it's a multifaceted effort because China's so big, but it's important. It's important enough for the effort.
David, we got time for one more? Okay.
Hi, Susan Taylor with the Church of Scientology International. If we could go back to Western Europe just very, very briefly. I'm really glad that you, all three of you, brought up this particular issue because as we speak, the French Abu Bakr piece of legislation is now in Belgium and it's being discussed right now in their parliament against minority religions, et cetera. And I was just wondering, how can we raise the level of awareness here in this country regarding Western Europe so we can nip things in the bud before things get really bad? And then what would you suggest that we can actually do about it, be really active and proactive about it?
I want you to solve that first, Randy, before.
I'd say, in the first place, don't overestimate our leverage, and that's just a practical matter. There's a growth industry in the pundit world about analyzing anti-Americanism. For my own part, I think sometimes we worry too much about it. On the other hand, there are public sentiments which unquestionably diminish our powers of suasion. You see that in the case right now of Mr. Strauss-Kahn and the different lessons that the French public draws from that affair than might we. So I'm not saying don't raise it. I'm just saying understand there are limitations on our particular powers of suasion. Where it comes back to is the existent institutional frameworks where we should be talking about all species of human rights issues. And that's, of course, things like the recurrent and formally chartered encounters between us and the European Union at the summit level and at the expert level. We are a non-voting member of the Council of Europe. We can raise issues in our Council of Europe context. We're all, the Europeans and we, members of OSCE. mention specialized meetings on subjects pertinent to the rights of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. The OSCE is a very good venue for raising this too, and has great expertise in it. The OSCE does a lot of work on religious liberty.
Anybody else?
I'll say a word, Tad, maybe. This is, in some ways, ironically, the most difficult of all. I mean, ironically, because these are mature democracies and they have written protections for religious freedom and so forth. Part of it is just because it's difficult to speak to the French about anything that has to do with changing their behavior. I recall vividly 10 years ago being in a meeting with Bob Seipel, who was then the ambassador, with the French Abu Picard. I forget who was the head of that. Not Abu Picard, but the French office that was designed to combat harmful sectarian activities. Alain, what was his name? He was Vivian. There you go. And you know, it was the most difficult. I've talked to Saudis, I've talked to Chinese, I've talked to really some bad guys, and had a much more reasonable discussion than we were able to have with the French. It's just you know, we were attacking them. This was their attitude, and even raising the issue of religion. And I chuckle now when I think about our friend who has disgraced himself in New York, Strauss-Kahn. I mean, I remember thinking, it was almost like we were asking them to talk about sex, you know. You're asking us to speak about religion. Religion is such a private matter. So this is tough. But I think that at the end of the day, the only way to get any of these countries, whether you're talking about France or China, to alter their behavior, their laws, their approaches, is to appeal to their own self-interest. And often this has to be done behind the scenes, certainly with the French. Nothing to be gained with giving speeches. I mean, it's fun criticizing the French, but you're just not. It's not going to have any impact, and obviously you get people irritated with you. I think the argument to be made with the French and some of the other Western Europeans is that your own policies are increasing the possibilities for religion-based terrorism in your countries. Not by the Scientologists or the Baptists or, you know, Opus Dei, but you're on these lists that the Belgians and the others are compiling, these harmful sectarian organizations. But your approach to religion is such that it excludes religious ideas and actors from the life of your country. And this is why we have terrorism, religion-based terrorism, in my view, incubated in and exported from many of the countries of the Middle East. You've got to bring them in. So, you know, this is obviously a long slog with the European governments, but it's an issue, it's an argument that goes to their interests, not our finger wagging, which won't work with any country of the world.
David, it's 2. It's 2 o'clock, David. 2:04. Should we stop or take any more? Oh, we do. Does anybody have another question? I could ask a question. Okay.
I'm Sean Connors. I've been with the Federalist Society's Madison Club for about 15 years. I had a question. I guess this is for you, Mr. Sonos. I guess you were in charge of putting this on. Did the society try to secure the attendance today of a representative from the administration? Because I guess if the audience members are like me, we would like to hear, you know, what somebody from the administration would like to say on the points that have been raised today.
We didn't. I mean, unless David did. Did we, David? No.
No, we did not. We had conceived the program as one that would focus on what advocates have to say about the rights of minorities. That's not to say that the United States government never advocates the rights of minorities. I don't think any of us would go quite that far. But we conceived the program as being representations on the part of organizations and spokespersons within the human rights community.
So with that, let's thank the panelists. Thank you for coming.